16 seconds. That was the time it took a four-man SAS entry team to clear the upper room of a converted warehouse on the outskirts of a joint NATO counter-terrorism training facility in central France. 11 seconds from breach charge to the final target down. Inside, 3 weighted mannequins lay in pieces, each one struck by a tight cluster of paired shots to the upper chest and head. A fourth mannequin, the designated hostage, sat untouched in the corner, the orange tape across its chest still perfectly intact. The senior French observer, a veteran officer of the Groupe d'Intervention de la Gendarmerie Nationale, lowered his clipboard and stared at the room. He turned to the British liaison standing beside him and said something quietly in French. The British officer didn't speak French well. He asked his interpreter what the man had said. The interpreter hesitated, then translated. He said, "Your men do not fight like soldiers." He said they fight like nothing he has ever seen. The Frenchman corrected him. "No, I said they do not fight like police officers." That distinction between fighting like a police officer and fighting like a soldier of the Special Air Service is the entire story. It is the reason that during the late 1970s and through the 1980s, the most respected hostage rescue unit in continental Europe found itself studying British methods with an intensity that bordered on professional obsession. It is the reason former SAS officer Chris Ryan, in interviews given decades later, described GIGN as superb operators while quietly maintaining that the two units occupied entirely different categories of warfare. And it is the reason that in the dim corridors of the training facility at Bains, west of Paris, French operators began asking questions about a regiment that had been refining the violent business of room entry since before most of them had been born. This is the story of how the British Special Air Service, founded in the North African desert in 1941 by David Stirling, evolved into a counter-terrorism force whose methods would force every other elite unit in Europe to re-examine its own doctrine. It is the story of why the line between police tactical work and military special operations is not academic. It is measured in the tenths of a second between a hostage living and dying. And it is the story of how a single live-fire demonstration conducted in front of Allied observers during the long shadow of the 1970s terrorist wave changed how France understood its own elite tactical unit forever. To understand the scale of the cultural collision between these two forces, you have to first understand what each one was. GIGN, the Groupe d'Intervention de la Gendarmerie Nationale, was established in 1973. Founded directly in response to the catastrophic failure of the West German police at the Munich Olympics massacre the previous year. The unit was small at first, fewer than 15 men. Its founder, Lieutenant Christian Proutot, built it as a gendarmerie unit, which is to say, a paramilitary police force operating under the French Ministry of the Interior with a mandate primarily focused on hostage rescue, counter-terrorism within French borders, the protection of government officials, and the apprehension of armed criminals. Their motto, "S'engager pour la vie," translates to a commitment to life. That commitment is not poetic decoration, it is the operational doctrine of the unit. From its founding, GIGN has been taught that respect for human life, combined with disciplined fire control, must take precedence over speed of action wherever possible. Their final qualification test, the tir de confiance or trust shot, requires a candidate to wear body armor and hold a piece of clay against his stomach, while another candidate fires a live round to break it. The exercise is designed to forge absolute trust in marksmanship and team cohesion. It is also a profoundly police-minded test. It assumes that the operator must be capable of placing a single perfect shot under the most extreme pressure imaginable, because the difference between a hostage living and dying may rest on that one round. The Special Air Service was something different. It was not a police unit. It was never designed to be a police unit. Its lineage traced back to Stirling's L Detachment in the Western Desert, where teams of 4 men in stripped-down jeeps had destroyed over 350 Axis aircraft on the ground. Its post-war reformation under John Woodhouse during the Malayan Emergency had refined a doctrine of small-team, deep penetration warfare in environments so hostile that conventional infantry could not function. By the time the British government, under Prime Minister Edward Heath, ordered the creation of a dedicated counter-terrorism capability in 1972, the SAS already possessed something no police unit in the world possessed: a combat lineage that ran continuously from the Desert War through the jungles of Southeast Asia to the streets of Belfast. The Counter-Revolutionary Warfare Wing, established initially as Pagoda Troop and drawn heavily from the regiment's bodyguarding cell, brought that combat lineage to bear on the new problem of urban hostage rescue. They built the Killing House at Sterling Lines, the purpose-built close-quarter battle facility with rubber-coated walls to absorb live ammunition and extractor fans to clear the cordite smoke. They began consuming ammunition at rates that defied the imagination of their continental counterparts. Reports from the period indicate that during a single rotation through the counter-terrorism standby role, an SAS operator could expend approximately 100,000 pistol rounds in training. 100,000 rounds, per man, per cycle. The Killing House was used every single day. Every single member of the team practiced room entry until the motion of breaching, identifying threats, and engaging targets had migrated entirely from conscious thought to reflexive motor function. The first time the world saw what this had produced was on the 5th of May, 1980, when B Squadron of the 22nd Special Air Service Regiment ended the 6-day siege at the Iranian embassy on Prince's Gate in central London. 6 armed men of the Democratic Revolutionary Front for the Liberation of Arabistan had taken 26 hostages. After negotiations had broken down and the captors had murdered press attaché Abbas Lavasani and thrown his body onto the pavement, Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher authorized the use of force. The assault, designated Operation Nimrod, lasted approximately 17 minutes from the first abseil rope dropping over the rear balcony to the final terrorist being killed in the embassy library. 5 of the 6 hostage-takers were killed, 1 was captured. 19 of the remaining hostages were rescued. 1 was killed during the assault, and several others were wounded. The action was broadcast live on British television and watched by millions, transforming the SAS from a secretive regiment whose existence was rarely acknowledged into a household name across the Western world. For European counter-terrorism units that had been quietly developing their own capabilities through the 1970s, Operation Nimrod was the moment everything changed. The footage of those black-clad figures abseiling down the embassy facade and blowing the windows in with frame charges was studied frame by frame in tactical training facilities from Wiesbaden to Sattery. And nowhere was that footage studied more intensely than at the GIGN headquarters near Versailles. The relationship between the SAS and GIGN in the years following Prince's Gate was one of professional admiration with an undercurrent of doctrinal tension. Both units recognized each other as among the finest of their kind in Europe. Both units periodically exchanged personnel for cross-training. The International Civil Aviation Organization had selected GIGN to organize hostage rescue exercises aboard aircraft for the special forces of other member states, a recognition of the genuine excellence the French had developed in that specific environment. GIGN's shooting standards were so high that, according to multiple accounts within the special operations community, the SAS regarded their shooting school as among the finest in the world. There was no question on either side of the channel that GIGN operators were exceptional. The question was a different one. It was a question of what the unit was actually for. GIGN, by mandate and by culture, was a hostage rescue and counter-terrorism unit operating within a domestic legal framework. Its operators were gendarmes, sworn law enforcement officers who happened to wear military rank and operate under military authority. When they entered a building, they entered it as police officers conducting a tactical resolution. The legal framework that governed their use of force was a police framework. The fundamental purpose of every operation was the preservation of life, including, where possible, the lives of the hostage-takers themselves. That is why the trust shot is performed with a piece of clay and not with a live target. That is why GIGN training emphasizes negotiation, containment, and the deliberate, patient resolution of crises. When the unit deployed to the hijacking of Air France Flight 8969 at Marseille-Provence Airport in December 1994, the assault on the aircraft was preceded by hours of negotiation, careful intelligence gathering, and a deliberate plan that minimized the number of operators required to enter the aircraft fuselage. The result was a stunning success. All 4 hijackers were killed. None of the remaining hostages died. Several GIGN operators were wounded, but every passenger walked off that aircraft alive. It was an operation that rightly entered the global counter-terrorism canon. It was also, fundamentally, a police operation conducted with military precision. The SAS approached the same category of problem from an entirely different direction. The regiment was not a police unit. Its operators were soldiers, trained from the moment they passed selection on the Brecon beacons to consider every entry as an act of deliberate, controlled violence designed to overwhelm an enemy faster than that enemy could react. The doctrine that emerged from the killing house at Sterling Lines was not a doctrine of negotiation or containment. It was a doctrine of compression, the compression of time, the compression of distance, the compression of the entire decision cycle of the people inside the room into a window so narrow that they could not respond to the assault before it was already over. When an SAS team entered a room, the assumption built into every motion of every operator was that the people inside that room would be killed unless they were unmistakably hostages. The discrimination between threat and non-threat had to happen at speeds that the human conscious mind cannot achieve. It happened at the level of trained reflex, and the training that produced that reflex was nothing like the training of a police tactical unit anywhere in the world. This was the doctrinal collision that played out across the 1980s as the two forces began to interact more frequently in joint training environments. The accounts of these exchanges, drawn from former operators on both sides who have spoken publicly about the period, describe a recurring pattern. SAS teams arriving at French facilities would conduct close-quarter battle drills at speeds that left their hosts visibly shaken. Engagement times that GIGN considered the upper limit of human capability were treated by SAS operators as starting points to be improved upon. The room clearance protocols differed not just in execution, but in the underlying assumptions about what a clearance was for. GIGN operators, trained within a police paradigm, paused at thresholds. They cleared corners with deliberate methodical movement. They issued verbal challenges where the operational situation permitted. SAS operators flowed through doorways in a continuous wave, weapons up, fingers indexed on triggers. Every man's arc of fire interlocking with the man beside him in a pattern so rehearsed that to an outside observer it looked less like a tactical movement and more like a single organism pouring through the breach. The numbers behind this difference are difficult to reconstruct precisely because both units guard their training metrics carefully. But the publicly available figures give an indication of the scale of the gap. GIGN candidates undertook a 1-week pre-selection followed, for those who passed, by a 14-month training program. Roughly 7 to 8% of candidates completed the full process. SAS selection, by contrast, was a 5 to 6 month brutalization conducted across the Brecon beacons in Wales, the jungles of Brunei or Belize, and the resistance to interrogation facilities at the regiment's training areas. Pass rates hovered between 10 and 15% of candidates who actually arrived to attempt the course, a figure that is misleading because the standards required even to apply for SAS selection had already eliminated the vast majority of British soldiers before they ever set foot on the hills. By the time a candidate was badged into the regiment and sent to the killing house, he had typically already served between 6 and 10 years in another unit, often in the Parachute Regiment or Royal Marines. His starting point was a level of soldiering that GIGN's candidates, drawn from the gendarmerie, did not necessarily share. both units produced extraordinary individuals. They produced extraordinary individuals from different starting populations, trained to different standards, for different operational mandates. The single demonstration that illustrates this collision most clearly was a live-fire room clearance exercise conducted during one of the periodic cross-training exchanges between the units. The specific date and location remain classified, and accounts of the exact circumstances vary in their details depending on which veteran tells the story. So what follows should be understood as a representative composite drawn from multiple consistent accounts in the open literature on European counter-terrorism cooperation. A team of 4 SAS operators, all of them members of the Counter-Revolutionary Warfare Wing's Standby Squadron, were invited to demonstrate British room entry methodology against a series of standard targets in a French training facility. The targets included weighted mannequins representing armed terrorists, additional mannequins representing hostages, and configured furniture designed to simulate a residential or office environment. The exercise was observed by a panel of French officers from GIGN, along with several members of Allied counter-terrorism units who happened to be present at the facility for cross-training. The British team had requested permission to conduct the demonstration with live ammunition. After some discussion regarding the safety protocols, permission was granted. The team stacked on the breach point. The lead operator carried a pump-action shotgun loaded with frangible breaching rounds, the kind designed to destroy the locking mechanism of a door without producing dangerous fragments inside the room. His 3 teammates carried Heckler and Koch, MP5 submachine guns fitted with suppressors and forward grips, the standard SAS counter-terrorism weapon of the period. Each operator wore black Nomex coveralls, a respirator, body armor over a load-bearing vest, and ear protection. They carried no spare equipment beyond what was needed for the immediate task. The breach charge was placed on the door. The countdown was initiated. The door blew inward. A single flashbang stun grenade arced into the room ahead of the lead man, detonating with the characteristic sharp report that disorients anyone unprotected within a confined space. And then the team was inside. What happened over the next several seconds was, according to the French observer who reportedly made the comment that titles this story, unlike anything he had ever witnessed in his career. The 4 operators flowed through the doorway in a single coordinated motion. Each man's weapon engaged a specific assigned threat within his arc of fire. The lead operator engaged the first target with a controlled pair, 2 rounds delivered to the upper chest in a spacing of less than 1 second. His weapon transitioned to a second target as he moved laterally to clear the doorway for the man behind him. The second operator engaged a target further into the room with another paired engagement. The third and fourth operators cleared the corners of the room, each man's eyes and weapon following arcs that had been rehearsed thousands of times in the killing house at Hereford. The hostage mannequin, marked with high-visibility tape across its chest to simulate a non-combatant, was acknowledged with a momentary weapon scan and then ignored as the team continued through the structure. By the time the last of the 4 operators had cleared his sector, the room had been declared safe, every armed target had been neutralized, and the hostage was untouched. The total elapsed time, as recorded by the timing officer present at the exercise, was reportedly under 15 seconds. The shots fired numbered fewer than the number of targets engaged would have suggested, because every shot had landed. There were no follow-up rounds expended on already neutralized threats. There were no ricochets, no missed shots, no unnecessary motion. The team flowed out of the room in the same coordinated movement they had used to enter it, weapons still up, eyes still scanning. The French observer, watching the entire sequence unfold, was reportedly silent for several seconds afterward. When he finally spoke, the words he chose, in the variant most consistently repeated by those who have written about the period, were a comment on the fundamental nature of what he had just seen. His operators, he indicated, fought with discipline and precision and at the highest standards their training had produced. But what the British had just demonstrated was not a higher standard within the same paradigm. It was an entirely different paradigm. His men, he said, fought like police officers. The SAS fought like something else. The remark was not a criticism of his own unit. He understood perfectly well what GIGN was for, and he understood that within its mandate it was unmatched. The remark was a recognition that the SAS occupied a category of warfare that police tactical units, even the very best police tactical units, simply did not occupy. The implications of this difference rippled through European counter-terrorism doctrine for years afterward. GIGN, to its enormous credit, did not respond to the British demonstration with defensiveness or denial. The unit's leadership had always understood the value of learning from other elite forces, and the relationship between the two units intensified rather than fractured in the wake of these exchanges. French operators began incorporating elements of British close-quarter battle methodology where it could be applied within the gendarmery's legal mandate. Engagement times in GIGN training reduced. The intensity of live-fire drills increased. The unit's shooting standards, already among the highest in Europe, were pushed even higher. By the time GIGN executed its assault on Air France Flight 8969 at Marseille in December 1994, the methodology on display was a fusion of the unit's own gendarmerie heritage with techniques absorbed from years of cross-training with units like the SAS, the West German GSG-9, and the American Hostage Rescue Team. The result was an operation that combined French patience and discipline with a kinetic intensity that 20 years earlier would have been alien to a gendarmerie unit. The 8-minute assault on the aircraft, which ended with all 4 hijackers dead and all remaining hostages alive, was a vindication of GIGN's willingness to learn from its allies without losing its own identity. For the SAS, the cross-training relationship was equally educational, though in different directions. British operators, accustomed to the doctrinal freedom of operating as soldiers in environments where rules of engagement permitted lethal force as the default response to armed threats, were forced to confront the reality that not every counter-terrorism scenario allowed that latitude. A hijacked aircraft full of civilians on European soil was not a building in Northern Ireland or a desert compound in Oman. The legal and political constraints that governed GIGN operations had forced the French unit to develop a level of fire discipline and target discrimination that the SAS could learn from. The trust shot, that final qualification exercise where one candidate fires a live round to break a clay disc held against another candidate's stomach, was studied with genuine respect at Hereford. It produced a kind of marksmanship under pressure that even the SAS's relentless killing house drills could not fully replicate. And the GIGN approach to negotiation, to the patient gathering of intelligence over hours or days before any decision to assault was made, became increasingly relevant to the SAS as the regiment's counter-terrorism work expanded into environments where the political and human cost of a failed assault would be catastrophic. The deeper truth that emerged from these exchanges, and that explains why the comment about fighting like police officers became something of a folkloric anecdote in the European counter-terrorism community, is that both units were exactly what they were designed to be. GIGN was the finest gendarmerie tactical unit in the world. The SAS was something else entirely. They were not better or worse than each other. They were optimized for different problems, and the problems they were optimized for produced different operators with different reflexes and different fundamental assumptions about what the act of entering a room meant. When a GING operator entered a room, the burden of proof rested on the threat. He was, at his core, a police officer making an arrest under conditions of extreme tactical violence. When an SAS operator entered a room, the assumption was reversed. The burden of proof rested on the non-threat because the operational environments the SAS had been built for, from the desert raids of 1942 through the Malayan jungles, the Aden Mountains, the Northern Ireland safe houses, and eventually the Iraqi compounds of the early 2000s, were environments where hesitation killed soldiers faster than aggression killed civilians. Both philosophies were correct within their domain. Neither philosophy translated cleanly into the other's domain. The friction between them, when the two units trained together, was the friction of two different answers to the same fundamental question of how trained men should resolve the violent business of confined space combat. What made the SAS demonstration so unsettling to its French observers was not that the British were faster, though they were. It was not that they were more accurate, though their marksmanship was extraordinary by any standard. It was that the British had clearly internalized a tempo of violence that GIGN's mandate did not permit them to cultivate. The French operators were watching men who had been trained since the day they passed selection on the hills of Wales to operate at the absolute physical limits of human reaction time in conditions where the legal and operational framework permitted them to err on the side of aggression rather than restraint. That is not a criticism of the SAS, and it is not a criticism of GIGN. It is a recognition that the two units were doing fundamentally different jobs and that the standards required for one job were not the same as the standards required for the other. The legacy of these training exchanges, conducted quietly and largely outside public view across the late 1970s, the 1980s, and into the 1990s, was a transformation of European counter-terrorism capability that benefited every participating unit. GIGN absorbed lessons from the SAS regarding tempo, breaching technique, and the use of distraction devices while retaining the patient, life-preserving doctrine that defined its identity. The SAS absorbed lessons from GIGN regarding fire discipline, hostage discrimination, and the discipline of operating within constrained legal frameworks where lethal force was the option of absolute last resort. The German GSG-9, the FBI hostage rescue team, and the Austrian Cobra unit all participated in similar exchanges and absorbed similar lessons. By the time the wave of major terrorist incidents of the late 1990s and early 2000s tested European counter-terrorism units, the doctrine that responded to those incidents had been forged in the cross-pollination of these elite communities. The remark itself, the comment that fighting like police officers was not the same as fighting like the SAS, became something of a private touchstone within the European counter-terrorism world. It was repeated in mess halls and training facilities for years. Former SAS members, when speaking publicly about their relationship with GIGN, were uniformly respectful of the French unit's capabilities. Chris Ryan, who served with the regiment during the relevant period and who later wrote extensively about his experiences, described GIGN as superb operators worthy of being placed alongside the SAS in the global hierarchy of counter-terrorism units. Tim Collins, the former SAS officer who commented publicly on the French operations against the Charlie Hebdo attackers and the hyper-casher supermarket gunman in January 2015, praised the speed and precision of the GIGN and raid assaults in unequivocal terms. There was no rivalry being expressed, no claim that the SAS was inherently superior to its French counterpart. There was only a recognition, quiet and consistent across decades of professional contact, that the two units were doing different jobs, and that the difference mattered. The Iranian embassy siege had announced to the world that the SAS existed. The cross-training exchanges with GIGN that followed in the 1980s demonstrated to the European counter-terrorism community what the SAS actually was. It was a regiment that had been quietly preparing for the violent business of confined space combat since David Sterling first wrote his proposal on a hospital bed in Cairo in 1941. By the time it arrived at the gates of the Killing House at Sterling Lines, that institutional knowledge had been refined for nearly 40 years. And by the time it stood in front of GIGN observers at a French training facility somewhere west of Paris, it carried a tempo and an underlying assumption about violence that no police-derived unit could fully match without abandoning its own foundational mandate. The French observer's remark, in whatever exact form it was originally spoken, captured a truth that no amount of equipment standardization or joint training could erase. There are two different ways to enter a room with weapons drawn. One is the way a police officer does it, with the law and the preservation of life weighing on every motion. The other is the way the SAS does it, with the calculation of military necessity governing every decision before the breach charge has even been placed. Both are honorable, both are necessary. They are not the same thing, and the elite gendarmerie of France understood this with absolute clarity the moment the smoke cleared from that training room and the British team walked out, their weapons still up, their formation still intact, and the hostage mannequin in the corner still wearing its bright orange tape across an unmarked chest. That was the SAS. That has always been the SAS. And that is why, when Pentagon planners would later draft the assessments that we examined in the Iraq operations of the mid-2000s, the Americans would find themselves asking the same question the French observer had asked decades earlier. How do they move like that? The answer, as it had been since 1941, was that they had never been a police force. They had been built for war from the first day of their existence, refined by every campaign their nation had asked them to fight, and brought to the doors of their target buildings by a selection process and a training regime that produced men whose fundamental reflexes were different from those of any other elite unit in Europe. The French saw it first in those quiet exchanges that took place out of the public eye in the years after Prince's Gate. The Americans would see it later in the safe houses of Baghdad and the mountains of Afghanistan. And the lesson in both cases was the same. There is the police way, and there is the SAS way. Mistake one for the other, and you will misunderstand what is about to happen the moment the door comes off its hinges. In the years since those training exchanges, both units have continued to evolve. GIGN has nearly doubled in size, growing from the small specialized unit it once was to a force of approximately 1,000 operators, with regional branches across France and the overseas territories. It has participated in over 1,800 operations, rescued more than 600 hostages, and built a record that places it firmly among the most experienced counter-terrorism units in the world. Its operators continue to wear the dark blue gendarmerie uniform that announces them as police officers first and tacticians second. They continue to live by the motto, s'engager pour la vie, and to train under the assumption that every operation they undertake must be conducted under the legal framework that governs French law enforcement. The SAS has continued to do what the SAS has always done. Its operations remain largely classified, acknowledged only through the carefully managed accounts of veterans who write within the constraints permitted to former members. Its selection process continues to break candidates on the Brecon beacons twice a year, and its standby squadron continues to rotate through the killing house at Hereford on a cycle that has not fundamentally changed since the 1970s. The regiment has fought in the Falklands, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in operations against Daesh in Syria, and in dozens of smaller actions across the world. It has lost men, it has buried them, and it has continued to produce the kind of operator who can flow through a doorway in 11 seconds and leave behind a room in which only the right people are dead. The comment about fighting like police officers was not, in the end, an insult. It was a recognition. The French officer who reportedly made it understood his own unit's mandate perfectly, and he understood that GIGN's commitment to life was not a weakness, but the essence of what the unit had been built to defend. He was acknowledging, in the language of a professional who had spent his career studying the worldwide community of elite tactical units, that his men and the British men he had just watched were not in the same business. They were both doing necessary work. They were both doing it at the highest level their respective systems could produce. But the work itself was different, and the difference would always be visible the moment the breach charge fired and the room filled with the controlled fury of trained men carrying out the violence of their respective doctrines. That is the legacy of the SAS demonstration that humbled an elite French unit. Not a victory, not a defeat. Not a humiliation in the literal sense, because GIGN has never been humbled by anyone in its actual operational record. It is a recognition, preserved in the quiet lore of European counter-terrorism, of the moment when one of the most respected police tactical units in the world watched the British Special Air Service work in a confined space and understood with absolute clarity that they were watching a different category of soldier. The French had built the finest commitment to life they could engineer. The British had built the finest expression of military violence in a confined space that decades of war had been able to refine. Both units left that exercise the better for having watched the other. And the comment, in whatever form it was originally spoken, remained as it was meant to remain, not as criticism, not as boast, as truth. The kind of truth that elite operators recognize in each other when the smoke clears and the room is silent and the mannequins in the corner still wear their unmarked tape across uncrossed chests. That is the SAS. That has always been the SAS. And on a training day in central France, on a date that no public document records, the gendarmes of GIGN saw it for themselves. They watched 4 British soldiers walk into a room and walk out again with everything done that needed to be done, and nothing done that did not. And they understood in that moment what the British had been quietly preparing for since 1941. Not a way of policing, not a way of arresting, a way of fighting. The British way of fighting. The way that does not stop being the SAS way, no matter what door the team is stacked against, no matter what country the mission is being executed in, and no matter how many decades have passed since David Stirling first sketched out his idea for a small unit of exceptional individuals on a hospital bed in Cairo, in the middle of a desert war that no one had yet imagined would echo this far. "You do not fight like police officers," the Frenchman had said. He was right. They never had. They never will.